The Mindfulness and Grief podcast offers compassionate insights for coping with grief and life after loss. I'm your host, Heather Stang. Welcome to episode 6 of the Mindfulness and Grief podcast. Today's guest is Claudia Coenen, who is the author of a book that just came out called Shattered by Grief, Picking Up the Pieces to Be Whole Again. And she also created a card deck that I have seen many times at ADEC and finally have on the way to my house. And they're the Karuna card deck. And I know that that's rooted in compassion, and you'll tell us more about that shortly. Claudia is also a fellow in thanatology and a certified grief counselor in private practice. So Claudia, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I'm wondering if you'd like to start by maybe telling us what brings you to this work. But usually I just let you go from there. But in reading more about you and your website, you pose a question to us that I'd like to read for the audience that I think might inspire your answer. You say, how can life events help us transform into better, more compassionate and connected humans? How can we approach each day, each relationship with awareness and love? I think that's so beautiful. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. You know, the challenge for me was when I became suddenly widowed in 2005. It was extremely unexpected, and we were on vacation. And while I was collapsed on the ground in hysteria and the EMTs were trying to revive my husband, I also was sort of hovering above myself thinking, your life is radically changed. Now what? Because my whole life, my approach has been, if difficulty happens, what can I do with it? How can I transform what has happened to me into making me a better person and more connected? The word Karuna means compassion, but it also means an active compassion. And the reason that I use this word is because my husband wrote it on the top of all of his letters. And at the time, after he died, we sort of looked for his letters. I was trying to see if he had written any journals because I'm a very prolific journaler. And I kept finding this word, and we looked it up and we saw what it meant, and we thought about him, and he was one of the most compassionate people we knew. And at that time, without really thinking very much about what I might do in the future, I decided that if I ever did anything new, I would call it the Karuna Project in honor of him. And also because I wanted to manifest more compassion in my own life, in relationship to him and to his death. My story begins at that moment in New Mexico, and afterwards, in the subsequent months, while I was trying to pull myself up off the floor on which I felt completely shattered and broken, I went to my go-to thing, which is creative process. I've been a musician, I've been a dancer, I've been a long-term journaler, as I said, I've written poetry. I've always go to creative process in order to pull myself out and sort of figure out what's happening inside of me and find a way to reframe it and work through it. And while I was doing that, I was also had that same kind of a split, like, oh, look at that. That's interesting. That might help other people. I didn't really know how to do that. But after a couple of years, when I was able to concentrate a little more, I went back to school, and I decided to become a creative grief counselor, to try to use what I know and what I know how to use to help other people, and see if I could encourage people to use their own creativity to help them through their grief.
Which is so lovely, because the creative part of the brain, from what I understand, is different from the side of the brain that experiences trauma. And so it really balances out the experience. And also it doesn't, in the mindfulness realm, it's not tied to a should. Creativity is not, you should be this way. It's
Right.
How are you? How do you want to express?
Yes. And it's also about process. It's not, I mean, if I encourage somebody to do a drawing activity, perhaps, it's not about what it looks like. It's about connecting with how you feel inside, with the colors that you're smearing on the page, whatever the image is that then will speak to you. And then you could probably toss the image out if you feel like it. Maybe you might come up with something that you like, but that's not the point. The point is the process and how you're expressing what you're feeling.
And I imagine integrating how you are during the creative process with how you are in your grief experience, how you are in your life, how you are with other people.
Yeah, and integration is really the key word, because when you feel broken by grief, which is often something that people feel, they just feel like their life has been radically changed. Everything is broken. What they knew, where they knew they were going, the trajectory that they were on is suddenly gone. Some people say, I don't feel the ground under my feet, or the rug's been pulled out from underneath me. So there's all these metaphors that we use to express, and words are good for that, but sometimes talking about it is not that effective. Sometimes you need to do something else. And maybe you just need to be in a mindful place, or you need to go sit under a tree and breathe. And, so that'll help you regulate your emotions. So then you can figure out what to do from there.
I imagine there are a lot of people listening that you've worked with, that I've worked with ourselves in our own grief, where there are no words. Mm-hmm. There are no words, and yet we have something deep inside of us we want to express or externalize or explain. And that creative process is so key. So for you, when you're working with a client, I'm assuming you're not working with people who are all artists or all comfortable with art. So what advice do you have for someone who wants to explore their grief in a creative way, but might feel that resistance, the labels, I'm not an artist, I'm not a painter, that type of thing.
I had that. I mean, I was a musician and a dancer and a choreographer, but I can't draw. I could never draw. And if anybody made a suggestion to me, well, why don't you come do this art workshop with me? I would be like, well, I can't do that. So, I have experienced that resistance in myself. The Karuna cards were developed for just that purpose. Because when I was working in hospice, I was recommending to people, why not journal? Journal out your feelings, write a letter to your father, or you say that there's something that you wish you had said to your spouse. You could write it in your journal. You can process it. You can write your story. You can write a fairy tale. And they're like, oh, that sounds great, but I don't know where to begin. So I began developing these little slips of paper that were little prompts that then I could say, well, here's 6 pieces of paper, choose one and do that. And then that expanded into, 28 pieces of paper. And then it expanded into 40 little business card things that I tried to print them on. And then it expanded into a deck of cards, which has then been published. So now it's 52, just because that's a standard deck.
Right. We want to have, grief, there's a lot working against us. At least we want to have a full deck, right? So I'm wondering if you have some cards that you could share with us.
Yeah, so let me just show you the box.
Yeah, will you raise it up just a little? Oh, beautiful.
Yeah. So they're called Karuna cards, creative ideas for grief and difficult life transitions, because you can use these not just for the grief because of death. There's a lot of grief over other things, or difficult times in your life. Perhaps you suddenly have to move from where you used to live, or job loss or divorce or other things that do cause grief reactions. These can be very helpful. So there are a lot of different types of prompts. There are journaling prompts, and one of them says, complete this sentence and keep writing. I am lovable because. And this one is because we often feel like somebody that we love and that has cared for us is gone or is not in our life anymore. Then we wonder, who's going to love me again? What is lovable about myself? And so this prompt will help you explore that.
And that's such an act of self-compassion, which we often talk about how important, just how helpful being kind to yourself can be when we're in the throes of grief and just in life in general.
Right.
Yeah.
And here's another one, a very simple one. It says, how are you courageous?
Oh, wow.
So, and within the very weak feeling of grief, when you're feeling so overwhelmed by emotion, it's hard to think of yourself as courageous. And again, it's sort of a different way of looking at your experience. Many people will tell the griever, oh, you're so strong, or even you should be strong. And I just hate that. I mean, I think I was once at the deathbed of someone, and the widow was weeping against the doorway, and one of her friends was there, and she said, oh, you just have to be strong. And this was about an hour after her husband had died. And I just turned to her and blurted out, I think strength is highly overrated.
Right. Right.
Brene Brown talks about the strength and vulnerability. And so when I ask, how are you courageous? Or if you ask yourself that, if you pull this card and you ask yourself, how am I courageous? It could be that I am courageous enough to allow myself to fall apart and to allow myself to just completely weep on the floor until I'm spent. And then to say, I have the courage to get up.
Absolutely. And that totally resonates with me, because week 4 in my program is called Skillful Courage, the dance of strength and vulnerability.
Right.
And when I first heard Brene Brown speak, I was like, yes, grief is such a tender place.
Mm-hmm.
And to turn into it does take, some courageous action as well.
Exactly. I mean, that reminds me of a book that helped me a lot when I was grieving. Because I couldn't concentrate and I couldn't read, more than a sentence or two at a time. And Thich Nhat Hanh's Taming the Tiger, Working Through Difficult Emotions. And it has like very short sentences in it. And you can just open it up and something will come out. And there's one, and I'm paraphrasing it, but he says, you have to cook your anger like potatoes for 10 minutes until they're soft and palatable.
so wise.
But the idea of taking a really difficult emotion that you're having trouble expressing and you're having trouble handling it, and sort of softening it and until it's malleable, and you can actually sort of hold it to your heart and give that difficult emotion some love, and it helps you get through it.
Do you mind showing us the flip side of the card so we can see the others? Flip it once more. So for those of you who are listening, not watching, on one side it has these beautiful circular patterns, and then I love the inside is so simple. It's this beautiful kind of soft colors with just that prompt on it.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that.
This particular card does not have very many words. There are other cards that have a lot of words.
So we have a variety, right? Yeah,
and
that's nice.
This one is more of a mindful prompt. It says, sit outside in a quiet place. Notice colors, scents, the breeze, the feel of where you are. Notice your body sitting quietly in a beautiful place. Breathe, taking it in for a while. Write the first 6 words that come into your mind, and then continue to write.
Beautiful. Thank you for reading that. There might be people who want to go back and replay that and actually do that. In fact, I encourage anyone listening, take that as a free card right there for you to just take. and getting out into nature is also so healing. When we're grieving, we get to see the bigger picture of life. So you mentioned how hard it is to read and concentrate, and that's why I think it's kind of funny as a grief author. It's like, and why your cards are such a genius offering, because it is hard to take in a lot of words. It's hard to study the mind. Again, hard to study the mind even when we're not grieving, but when we are, we know that the mind is distracted and irritable and sleepy and anxious, and it is like taming a tiger in a sense. So.
Yes.
Yeah. So what about the book you've just written, transitioning from cards to book?
So I wrote in 12 journals the year after he died. I had a lot of trouble sleeping, and I would keep a book next to me so that if I had a bad dream or I had, ruminating thoughts in the middle of the night, I could just grab the journal and scribble them out. And I continued to journal as I went through my schooling. When I started in hospice, I actually stopped writing because it was so intense, the experience of working with families, working with dying patients, helping my staff, because the staff was very activated a lot of the time, and I would often have to pull them out and do some work with them too. I would be asked by the clinical supervisor to do that. So I knew that there probably was a book somewhere in what I was doing, but I also did not want to write a memoir. I didn't want it to be only about me. So I think that while I got very angry with myself when I stopped writing, that, I should be writing, I should be working on this book, I think it was really important for me to be able to gather other people's stories in terms of the work that I was doing in hospice, and then as I developed my private practice, so that I could broaden the experience of grief, my understanding of the experience of grief, which was different than my own because I experienced a very sudden, unexpected death. So the people who have long-term illness in their loved ones, a lot of caregiving, a slow decline, a lot of different issues and situations that feed into how they process their grief, either during the diagnosis, during the death, and afterwards. I needed that kind of information, and also stories from other people. And as I joined ADEC and studied with Dr. Balk at Brooklyn College, I also broadened my understanding of the research in grief and how to apply that. So the book contains all of those things. The book contains my story. It contains stories from my clients and from other people. It has psychoeducation and thanatological education in there. And it also gives you a guide to getting through your grief, which is contained in the word whole. So picking up the pieces to become whole again, become the chapter headings, WHOLE. So W is who am I and what happened. So it's the narrative. It's telling the story because we often want to tell that story over and over again in the beginning. And then also there's an identity crisis now. Who am I now? Who am I now that I'm not a wife? If my parents are gone, am I a daughter or am I an orphan? What am I? We had a client in hospice who came to a support group who said, well, I have 7 siblings. Oh no, I only have 6. And we're like, well, yes, you still have 7. One of them is dead, but you still have 7. So there's an identity crisis that needs to happen, and an exploration. So that's W. H is help. And how do I get through this?
Which I think is probably a relief for people to hear that there's a chapter called that.
Yes. So, and that has a more practical, these are some things that you can do. O is opening to emotion, because we have to experience our feelings. We have to allow them to flow. And, there's some guidance in terms of how to let that happen, how to titrate your emotions. And then L is learning to live fully again. So starting to explore, what would I like my life to look like? Who do I want to be? If I have an identity crisis and now I'm putting myself back together, who do I want to be? What do I want to do with my life? And then E is where the continuing bonds are located, exploring the past to experience the future. So putting things into perspective.
For those who are listening, can you explain what continuing bonds are? I mean, you and I as thanatologists know this, but I think it's an important concept to share.
Yes, exactly. So, when we go through our process of grief after someone dies, we do need to find ways to adjust. We need to find ways to adapt in our lives. We need to express our emotions. We need to sort of recognize that the loss has happened and learn how to accept it and incorporate it into our lives. But there's also a very compelling need to try to feel connected to the person that was so integral to your life. And that's now that the term for that is continuing bonds. So finding ways to bring who they were forward into your life, to feel connected to them, maybe to do things that are commemorative on certain days. And, for some people, it's actually, trying to feel the presence of them. And, I've never been one to sort of seek that out, but to my surprise, it happens. So.
And for you, I think in a way you're living it, because you are living, you and your husband have that same value of compassion and care. And so you're embodying it, and I see it in other people, and sometimes I catch it in myself, where you don't even know you're doing it.
Right.
But you're living your life in a way that's helping you stay connected.
Yeah. And also living your life, to some extent, it's sort of a little bit of, what would he have wanted you to do, and it doesn't have to be so huge, like everything that you do has that context. But I know for my children, they have made specific choices in their lives that are connected to their father and that are commemorative. And I'll give you a very good example. My son and his father had a plan for after he graduated from high school. In the year between high school and college, when he was 18, my husband was going to take him to Three Finger Jack in Oregon and go backpacking. My husband had done an outward bound trip there when he was 18, and he wanted to go with his son and have this, male bonding father-son experience. But he died when Eben was 17. So that has always been on Eben's mind and on his list of things to do. He recently moved to Oregon and bought a house about 40 minutes away from Three Finger Jack. And 2 weeks ago, when his wife turned 30, the two of them went on a backpacking trip on Three Finger Jack.
Wow. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And how did he feel after the trip?
He said that he felt really good. He said that he really thought about his father a lot and that he would really like to go back and bring some of his father's ashes. Would I please bring him some? So I'm going to.
So it might almost become like a pilgrimage in a way,
Yeah,
you
I
know?
think so. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really lovely. I'm glad he has you as a mother too. You know, it's so hard I don't have children, so I can't speak to it myself, but just in talking to people, you know, how do I help my children weave the parent into their lives, you know, and there's a lot of things that we can do. And it sounds like, you know, he was able to kind of come up with his own way. There
Yeah.
isn't one right way to do it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it was very, very hard for all of us.
Mhm.
And you know, in the book, I talk a lot about what my process was, and I really tried very hard to keep their lives as together as possible, and to make sure that they still went to the prom and you know, went to sleepovers and went on vacations with whatever they were going off with their friends and doing things. And I tried very, very hard, but it has also been driven home to me that I really was quite a basket case in that first year. And, you know, it was rough. It was very rough for all of us.
As it will be, you know, grief is not pretty and graceful.
Mm-hmm. No, it's
No,
not.
not at all. So moving back to the creativity, because I'm really interested in this. What are some, you know, for people who are listening, we've given them a meditation practice they can do
Mm-hmm.
and a writing practice they can do. What is something that they could do today or in the next couple days to just help them turn towards their grief in a creative way? Is there a particular exercise that is a go-to or that you think is accessible to anyone, no matter whether they're in the early days, weeks, months of grief or years down the road?
Well, one of the cards, and I didn't pull it, so I can't. I just have to paraphrase it. Suggests that if there are quotes or music or poetry that is really moving to you, like little phrases that really are very meaningful, just simply jot those down in your journal. You know, if there's a song that moves you to tears because it feels so connected, you could write all the lyrics in your journal. Um, so that's one way. Or if a picture is meaningful to you, you know, because your journal is not only for writing down things. You know, a journal is not. It's not really. It's not a diary. You know, dear diary, this morning I talked to Heather. You know,
Right.
I mean, it can be if you want, but it's
Yeah.
more. It's more of a holding, like of a container for a variety of things. And if you want to be thinking about what your future might look like, you could flip through magazines and find words that, you know, pop out at you. Like, I knew that I wanted to be a grief counselor, but I didn't know how. But I wrote grief, healing. I gathered these words and I pasted them into my journal with pictures of a desk and pictures of a telephone where people would call me to come to my office, you know. So that's another way. It's to make a collage of what you want to manifest in your life is another creative exercise.
I love those aspirational collages.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I do that in my day-long retreats. And, you know, it could be about career based, it could be about just health or,
Right.
you know, changing your diet or when my stepfather died, he was a photographer, but I was never allowed to touch his cameras. I remember one time I was like, "Can I borrow that?" And he's like, "No." I didn't realize what a nice camera it was. But I wound up, you know, with those cameras. And while I couldn't touch them for months because I felt like he was almost watching over me, I
Uh-huh.
also felt like touching them would make it real.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but when I finally picked them up, you know, I became fascinated with it. And I actually have an aspirational collage I made where I put one of those cameras on it. And it was about me trying to learn from him, you know, posthumously through the collection of his art I have, through the few recordings I found of him recording a class,
Oh.
you know, and so I've become quite the mediocre amateur photographer, and it feels great,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So it can be about so many different things. It can be
Right.
about, you know, becoming more mindful. It could be about writing. But you bring up a great point, and that is that a journal is not necessarily just words. And I've seen one person in our Sangha brought in her journal where she writes and does collage in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm fascinated by that, because it
And
gives you
I do that.
freedom.
Yeah, I do that too. I
Yeah,
also
cool.
want to riff on something that you said
Mm-hmm.
before. Another way to use creativity is when you have a really strong metaphor that you're talking about, to draw it out. So, for example, I had a client a long time ago who came into the office and she said, I just feel like I'm in a complete whirlpool. The whirlpool is just swirling around me and it's sucking me down, and I feel like I'm going to drown. So rather than ask her to talk about that, I gave her a piece of paper and some crayons and said, here, draw your whirlpool. So she drew a very dark black circle, like a spiral on the page. And then I asked her to draw where she was in it. And she was kind of swirling inside. And I asked her how she could get out of it. And so she said, well, I'll just swim to the shore. I said, well, if it's a whirlpool, you probably can't. So we drew her going around and around and around to the edge. And then we also brainstormed for somebody to be on the shore with a hook. So by just through the act of drawing it and figuring out, what could help me, what tools do I need, what's the best pathway to get out of this swirl that's sucking me in. And once she was finished with the drawing, she sat down and she sighed really deeply and she said, wow, I've never drawn a picture before, and that feels really good.
And there's a metaphor of the person on the shore with the hook, isn't there?
Yeah.
Can't do it alone.
Right.
Which I often say is, the one thing that pretty much every grief professional can agree on is the importance of having someone else.
Yes.
Whether it's a professional or a caring friend or family or Sangha or spiritual community or church, just having that person with a hook, which, can be hard to find, but when you find it, it can be incredibly healing.
Yeah. And one of the Karuna cards asks you to reflect on who's in your corner, who supports you.
Yeah.
And I sometimes will ask my clients, draw a circle on the page and just write everybody that is there for you inside of it.
Wow. And I think it is helpful to reflect on that, because our landscape of friends so often changes when we're grieving. And so we sometimes have to find new people,
So yeah, that's true. Sometimes it's surprising the people that you think will definitely be there for you are precisely the ones that can't handle it.
Right. Yeah. I see it in families. We see it a lot, of course, because everybody's grieving.
Right.
And so having compassion for the fact that everybody's grieving is often a practice that we do in our meditation class too.
And to be able to say, okay, this person is not particularly helpful to me right now, so maybe I need to be with other people. And actually, one of my clients yesterday asked me, I feel like my siblings are toxic to me. Is it okay for me not to talk to them? Like, yeah.
Yeah. That comes up more often than not, doesn't it?
Yeah.
As an only child, I haven't had that experience, but I see it all the time. So, but permission to take care of yourself, however it is, which sometimes is distance from other people, is helpful too. So as we kind of start to come to the end of our time together, which I feel like you and I could probably talk forever, because number one, I used to be a dancer too, but so someday maybe we'll get together and choreograph a dance of grief or a dance of love or joy or something. But I wanted to give you the chance to maybe share with people who are listening, how can they find you? What can you offer them? Where your book is, that type of thing. So your website, et cetera.
Okay. So the website is thekarunaproject.com, all one word, Karuna project.com. And so I can be reached through that. My email is there, and information about me and my practice is there. The book is available on Amazon and at Barnes & Noble online, and also at the Jessica Kingsley Publishing site. That's the publisher, Jessica Kingsley Books. And the Karuna cards also are available in that way. The Karuna cards actually sold out in April, and the second printing has just hit the U.S. So they are now available. I've actually been having trouble since the ADEC conference was when I found out. I wanted to bring 50 decks of cards with me, and I could only bring 6. And I've been struggling because I've done some other book events, and I just spoke at a conference in Washington, D.C. this past weekend, and I literally couldn't get my own cards. So they're out now, and they're available, and they're a great tool, and they're great for processing on your own individually, or to work with a friend or somebody who's supportive. They are being used in support groups. I use them in my sessions. I just have them in my office, and I'll pull them out. Often I'll do it at the end of the session, towards the end, and sort of assign it as homework. Maybe you want to do this when you go home. Right. So my client will take a picture of the card and take it home. So that way they don't have to buy the deck if they don't want to.
That's very generous of you.
And my private practice is in Hudson, New York. I have seen people at their homes in other locations, but it takes a lot of travel. The hospice that I worked in was in New Jersey, and so I would see people in New Jersey, but mostly the people that I see are up in Hudson. I do see people over Skype or on the phone as well. That is a possibility for people who are not near me.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Well, overlay for those of you who are watching, you can see the web address right now. For those of you who are listening, that will be in the show notes at mindfulnessandgrief.com, as well as in the description on iTunes and Google Play, wherever you're listening to this podcast, so you can get her information easily. And I am absolutely grateful for your willingness to spend this time with us and share your wisdom, your path, your journey, these different creative approaches to grief, and it weaves so well into the mindfulness and self-compassion piece that I'm passionate about, that you're passionate about. And in closing, I'm wondering if there's anything you want to leave our audience with, something that can inspire them as a takeaway.
We all have the ability to get through tragedy. If we're willing to sort of work through it and give ourselves compassion and explore all the possibilities, we can get through it. It is possible. And it is possible also to transform who we are as a result of this tragedy. So when I talk about transformation of grief, I'm not necessarily saying we're going to transform it and it's going to go away. How can we be transformed from having had that experience? It's like an alchemical process. Mm-hmm. And we do have the capacity to do it.
We do. And you are evidence of that.
Well, thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure talking with you, Heather.
Thank you, Claudia. Namaste.
Namaste.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Mindfulness and Grief Podcast. If you found what you heard useful, please consider rating, reviewing, or subscribing to our podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. For more grief support, please visit our website at mindfulnessandgrief.com, where you will find free guided meditations, supportive articles, and online courses and groups. Special thanks to our sound engineer, Todd Campbell, and to the Atomic Mosquitoes for the opening and closing music. I'm Heather Stang, and I hope these teachings will be of great benefit to all who receive them. Until next time, namaste.